Thank you, Keith. We're truly appreciative of your leadership and of the generosity you and Kathy bring to our dreams and initiatives here at the School of Design. Moving on to our commencement speaker. By the time I met Bill Witte, he was already leaving a large footprint of urban and multifamily housing across the state of California. He's now the president and managing partner of Related California and one of the most respected real estate executives in the United States. It took a while longer for me to learn the unusual path he followed to earn his leadership position in a value-creating industry filled with risks and also rewards. It's his story to tell, but its key coordinates include, in reverse order, being the deputy mayor for housing and neighborhoods and all development and redevelopment activities for the city in San Francisco, working in Washington at HUD and NARO, and serving in Philadelphia with the Office of Housing and Community Development, which began right after his Penn education, a BA in Urban Studies, and a master's in city planning. Bill also stands out from among his colleagues for his participation on the boards of numerous foundations and academic programs, including the Penn Design Board of Overseers. Please welcome Bill Witte.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, for those kind words. Congratulations to all of you. You have certainly earned your degrees. And I'm honored to appear before you today and your friends and family. And I'm doubly blessed because just before this, I got to experience the graduation of my daughter, Olivia, an architecture major in the undergraduate school at Penn. I can tell you she did not get that skill from me, as you will soon find out. Now, 38 years ago, I stood where you stand today, armed with my master's in city planning degree in hand. And like you, I'd spent the previous 2 years roaming around the corridors of Meyerson Hall. Now, that may make you think that it's getting a little bit long in the tooth. I prefer to think of it as venerable. Now, some of you may have come to the School of Design knowing exactly what you wanted to accomplish. Others, perhaps the majority, came with a general interest in design, the built environment, or urban policy. I was definitely in the latter camp. I had a vague notion of or interest in neighborhood revitalization, but I didn't have a set career path in mind, and I didn't have a concrete idea of what my ideal job might be. No one could have connected the dots in what would become my meandering road to the present. And the various decisions that I made after graduating ultimately worked out, but at the time, I didn't know that they would. So how will you know if the path you are taking is the right one for you? The honest answer is you won't. And if there's anything I can impart to you today to prepare you to accept that fact, then perhaps I can allay at least some of your angst. Now, all that said, you are far more prepared than you may think. And in any event, you are far better prepared than we were. Now, how do I know that? Well, I just ran into my old mentor from urban studies days and city planning at Penn, Norm Glickman, who still teaches here occasionally. And he said to me, "Witte, these kids today are much better than you guys were." I said, "Thanks, Norm. You guys have double majored and interned your way to Penn Design, and your curriculum has expanded to meet the challenges of a far more complex society." So today I'd like to share with you my experiences from the time I left Meyerson through a career that began in local government, meandered through urban policy in the federal government, shifted to the West Coast, and culminated in my current world of real estate development. It would have been impossible to predict then, and it took a while, but I found my passion just as you will find yours. I grew up in New York City and Southern Connecticut, raised by parents from Brooklyn and the Bronx. And despite my suburban pedigree, I loved all things urban. True story, for my 16th birthday, I asked my father to drive with me through the inner city neighborhoods of Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford. And I later wrote a paper on urban renewal while still in high school. Matriculating as an undergrad at Penn, I became part of the first group of urban studies majors. I wanted to change the world, one neighborhood at a time. I lived off campus at 44th and Walnut Streets and later in Powelton Village, and spent countless hours exploring South Philadelphia, Fishtown, and all the other Philadelphia neighborhoods. I played in summer basketball leagues in Frankfurt and the lower Northeast. I walked precincts for a city council candidate. City planning seemed a logical next step. Now, aside from Meyerson Hall, the School of Design was a very different place back in 1973 when I entered. The same disciplines that you have taken were offered, but the atmosphere was more like the Balkans than the interdisciplinary program that you have just completed. City planning on one side, architecture and urban design on another, landscape architecture with Ian McHarg back over here. And left to my own devices, I skillfully evaded any course that included even a slight whiff of design. Unable to draw even the simplest stick figure, I was afraid that my sheer incompetence would be exposed. But my only exposure to design, in fact, came when I religiously attended cocktail parties thrown by the Department of Architecture. They definitely had the best parties. Upon graduation, I took a job at City Hall in the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, newly formed to administer the fledgling Community Development Block Grant Program. Now, this was no longer, for you students of urban history, the Philadelphia of Ed Bacon and enlightened planning, but the city of Mayor Frank Rizzo, ex-police chief and working class icon. And my first public meeting was at 23rd and Diamond in the heart of North Philadelphia. And I can tell you there are plenty of neighborhoods where you would have felt comfortable in the Rizzo administration, but this was not one of them. I soon began working on an urban homesteading program. The city then had 25,000 abandoned housing units along the 5th Street corridor in what was known as West Kensington, which also happened to be the fiefdom of Councilman Harry Giannotti, a giant of a man, an avatar of ward politics, who was later convicted in the Abscam scandal. So if Penn was a bit of an ivory tower, this was trench warfare. Seeking a new experience and anxious to stay one step ahead of the unfolding corruption scandals, I moved to Washington, D.C. and slept on the floor of a friend's apartment for 3 months while I looked for a job. And after a couple of years lobbying for a public housing organization, I fell into a position in the last year of the Carter administration as executive assistant to the Federal Housing Commissioner at HUD. And this only happened because a friend of mine had just left, and with 9 months to go in an administration, no experienced, competent person would take such a job. And I'll always remember my interview with Assistant Secretary Larry Simons. He said, "I don't really know you. They tell me you're pretty good. I hope it works out." Well, it did. 8 months later, my boss received a call from newly elected San Francisco Mayor and now Senator Dianne Feinstein. She asked if he could recommend someone to be the city's housing director. At the time, Washington was really the center of the funding universe. He turned to 6 of us and asked if we knew any good candidates. I looked around the room, raised my hand, and said, I kind of like the job. Ever loyal to his staff, he called her back and told her one of the great white lies, that he had the perfect candidate. 3 months later, I moved to San Francisco, which for this East Coast kid might as well have been Tasmania, continuing a pattern of getting jobs for which I was manifestly unqualified. 9 years after that, and after running the city's housing and economic development programs, and briefly its public housing authority, I was introduced to Steve Ross, chairman and CEO of the New York developer The Related Companies, who was looking to expand his affordable housing business to California. Now, I had the equivalent of a PhD in urban politics and experience administering all these housing programs, but zero experience in the private sector. Nonetheless, I opened an office for Related in San Francisco, initially consisting of me and a secretary, and I did not need the secretary. It was not an auspicious beginning. I can remember after my first couple of years throwing elbows in the real estate development world, I came home and I said to my wife, you know, I don't think I'm a big enough jerk to be a real estate developer, except that's not the word I used. But I persevered, benefited from intensive on-the-job training, hired well, and learned from my new partners. And I've never stopped learning. It was a circuitous path, but what I do every day represents all the strands of the disciplines I first encountered at Penn. And I've come to appreciate each of those disciplines, each of the disciplines in which you are getting degrees, not only for their unique skill sets, but for how they work in harmony, how they must work in harmony in the most successful developments. And despite the self-imposed limitations on my technical training, I've been fortunate to be able to work on some of the most complicated and challenging development opportunities. And each encompasses the disciplines that you all have been studying and demonstrates the synergy required among them. Let me give you some examples. In the first, our company has redeveloped 4 obsolete public housing projects in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland into new mixed-income communities, and is working on 2 more. These present enormous challenges in not only reshaping the physical environment, in planning, urban design, and architecture, but in addressing long-ignored human and neighborhood needs. Another situation, we are nearing completion on a project in Santa Monica that includes 2 mid-rise luxury condominium buildings of about 160 units, side by side with 100 low-income rental units for families and 20,000 square feet of retail space. We've worked with 3 different architects, a landscape architect, our own in-house design and construction personnel and project managers, a transportation planner, and 2 artists in putting together this development. In Santa Ana, a city of 300,000 in Orange County that is perhaps the highest percentage of Hispanic residents in the country, we just completed a 2-phase affordable housing development that includes a transit-oriented development, 4 different kinds of housing, and the preservation of a series of historic cottages. And in our most visible and challenging project, we are in the midst of the redevelopment of 3 city blocks opposite the Frank Gehry designed Walt Disney Concert Hall in Bunker Hill in Los Angeles, which will include both Los Angeles' first vertically integrated mixed-use development, along with its most ambitious package of community benefits. And to add to the mix, last summer, as part of the project, we completed a new 16-acre public park. Now, what can one take away from these experiences? Well, first and foremost, our profession, and indeed today's world, as you heard earlier from Dean Taylor, views planning and design through a multidisciplinary lens. I recently asked Dean Taylor if she was an architect, or she considered herself an architect, planner, or urban designer. And I don't recall the exact answer, but I can tell you that the correct answer is yes. When you design a building or implement a plan, you help shape not only the built environment, but the lives of people who live, work, or visit in that community. And each of the design disciplines and all of the component parts that comprise, for example, a well-wrought neighborhood or community plan has a role to play in affecting that outcome. For example, the inclusion in a high-rise development site where you think just about the building of a small but well-conceived pocket park often can mean the difference between just a building and a real place. An example of that is last fall, my wife and I, when visiting my daughter, trekked to the Northern Liberties neighborhood of Philadelphia, which was an industrial wasteland with a dying brewery when I lived here. We were initially attracted to see the mixed-use apartment retail plaza project designed by Penn's own Scott Erdy, and that was indeed a fascinating piece of work. But what really struck us was how the community had developed organically into a thriving, walkable residential neighborhood with parks and restaurants, kids walking the streets. And to this day, I've wondered about the collective talents of the planners, designers, and other consultants that have had a hand in shaping its growth. You know, I've had the opportunity to work with Frank Gehry, Liz Diller, and Robert Stern, among other well-known architects. But I've also worked with many less well-known designers who are equally effective in transforming communities. And as a new member of the Board of Overseers, I recently had the opportunity to meet each of your department heads, some of whom I knew before, but most of whom I didn't. And I can tell you there is not a more impressive group in the country. And lo and behold, they actually seem to interact with one another and get along, and that will only be to your benefit. We've entered an era where creativity often trumps rote knowledge and where the lines between your disciplines blur. For example, where does site planning stop and landscape architecture begin? There are fields today populated by people with your skill sets that didn't even exist 20 years ago. Environmental planning and design, technology and all its permutations, product design. If you had said to somebody 20 years ago, uttered the phrase LEED certified, people would have looked at you like you had two heads. And to paraphrase Thomas Friedman, the world really is flat. Your opportunities will abound on a global scale. So what can I pass on to you from the twists and turns of my career arc? Well, first, focus on your immediate tasks, but look ahead. Woody Allen famously said that 90% of life is showing up. Well, I beg to differ. Opportunities present themselves when you least expect them, and change can be a healthy thing. Learn to listen and communicate, and I can't overemphasize this enough. Lacking the technical skills enjoyed by most of you, I've had a successful career built on communication skills. We live in a show me, tell me, explain to me world. So no matter how good an artist or designer you may be, you'll be even more effective if you can communicate and relate well to people. Be patient. I hope I don't sound like your parents here. My first two jobs were not all that challenging intellectually, frankly. As an architect, you might spend your first few years drawing stairwells in buildings. You know what? The partner in the corner office probably started that way too. One summer during my undergraduate years, before internships had become institutionalized as a thing to do during the summer, I worked as a dishwasher at a local country club. My father, unimpressed, asked me if I couldn't do better than that, and I said, well, no. And he said, okay, then be the best dishwasher you can be. And finally, be a leader. Leaders don't have to be company presidents. You lead by effort, by example, by thinking outside the box, even when you're not required to do so. Drafting a community plan and selling it to the neighborhood is leadership. Increasing the sustainability of a large mixed-use project is leadership. Serving on the board of a community-based nonprofit is leadership. Improving the lives of the residents of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, as a bunch of young professionals organized here at Penn by the Center for Urban Redevelopment Excellence did a few years back, is leadership. Working to improve the fabric of our cities at a time when government policies have frankly turned their attention elsewhere is leadership. When I was preparing this speech, my wife asked me what had motivated me at various points in my career, and I thought for a second and I said, I wanted to make a difference. You guys are doing great things. I've been hanging around here for a few years, and I've seen your work. I've talked to some of you, and it's very impressive. And as Vice President Biden said today, this is your time. Things are happening fast, and you can be a part of it. So go out there and make a difference. I know you can, and I'm confident that you will. Thank you.